Hello everyone, and welcome to 8-Bit Monsters. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the Troglodyte from the Monster Manual and deconstruct it into its basic elements to see what was going on when Wizards and Dungeons & Dragons decided to make this a CR 1/4 monster. And since this is such a low-level monster, this falls in line with the hell levels that I am focusing on with these videos. Eventually, I will move past these lower level monsters and actually start working on higher level monsters as well to see where their ratings come from and if they fall in line with what D&D has printed in the Monsters Manual. Now, looking over this monster, if you'd like to follow along, you can find the Troglodyte on page 290 of the Monsters Manual by Dungeons & Dragons. Now, this monster is a little different from the one we focused on last week. That monster, the bandit, had no traits to work with, so it was just a very straight calculation. This week, our monster actually has 3 traits to go along with its attacks and its defenses. This time, we're going to look at its 3 traits: chameleon skin, stench, and sunlight sensitivity. Now, if we look in the Dungeons Master's Guide, we'll take a look at the monster's stats and traits and find that only one of these is actually going to impact our monster at any given time. Now, if we take a look at chameleon skin and we look down this chart given to us by Dungeons & Dragons, we find that chameleon skin actually has no effect on the monster whatsoever. What does this mean? Well, it means that even though the monster now gets advantage to its stealth checks, it probably won't be hiding in combat, and therefore has no real bearing on how the combat scenario will pan out. So we're going to skip over chameleon skin, not even worry about adding it into our calculations, and take a look at the next trait that the Troglodyte has. This next trait is stench. Now this one actually does affect our monster in combat because our players within 5 feet of the Troglodyte actually need to roll a Constitution check. Now, because of this, and it affecting the play of battle and giving the monster a bonus, we actually have to consider and put that into the calculations. Now, what does this do? Well, if we continue reading on for stench, it actually gives our monster an effective +1 AC bonus. Now, this is actually pretty important because our monster, the Troglodyte, has very little natural armor as a monster. So we'll get into that more when we actually look at the defensive combat rating of the Troglodyte. Next, we'll take a look at sunlight sensitivity. Now, this is interesting because I've looked at other monsters in the past to see how sunlight sensitivity should technically affect it, but because it's not really beneficial to the Troglodyte during combat, it doesn't get calculated into the monster's final CR, which I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing in the end. With that in mind, since sunlight sensitivity also gives no effect to the Troglodyte, we don't have to worry about calculating that in. So next, let's take a look at the defensive combat rating. So we're just going to jump right into our defensive combat rating for the Troglodyte. So we first always start with the hit points of the monster. And in this case, our monster has a 2d8 + 4, which averages out to 13 hit points. We take that and we look at our monster statistics chart as we did before with the bandit. And we find that this monster has basically the same CR rating for hit points and defensive. Our monster has a CR 1/8 defensively. Not great for such a low level monster. So because of this CR 1/8, we then look at its armor class. Well, it has a natural armor class of 11. Now, because the Troglodyte has a +0 in dex, it gains no benefits from being very quick and dexterous. So, D&D and Wizards decided to give the Troglodyte harder skin, so this creature actually has natural armor this time around, giving it an armor class rating of 11. Not great, which would actually affect our effective hit point CR rating. Now, if we look at that, this would be a difference of 11 to 13, giving us a -2. Now, normally, we would take that and subtract 1 from the CR rating of the effective hit points. but because we have the stench AC bonus of +1, we don't change the effective hit point rating. Now, normally, like I said before, this would switch it from 1/8 to 0, but because of that 1 AC difference between what the monster actually has versus what's expected, we don't need to worry about adjusting the CR. So next we're going to take a look at the offensive combat rating. The interesting thing is that our Troglodyte actually has 3 attacks from its multi-attack. So we have our Troglodyte here with a multi-attack of 3, which means it can do 1 bite and 2 claws. So luckily our Troglodyte has exactly the same damage on both of its attacks between the bite and the claws. The damage only works out to be 4 for either, regardless of which you use, the bite or the claws. Because our monster has those 3 multi-attacks, it gets 1 bite and 2 claws during combat every round. So it's going to be averaging out to 4 damage for 1 bite, 4 damage for 1 claws, 4 damage for another claws, totaling out to 12 average damage every round. So we go down the damage per round column and we find that our monster with 12 damage per round is actually in the CR1 category offensively. This is pretty crazy and very intense for level 1 to 3 players. Our players can't really take that kind of damage in a hit per round. It's pretty nuts. With that in mind, that we now know our monster is hitting as hard as a CR1 monster, we take a look at the attack bonus. Now, the attack bonus is a +4 in this instance because of the +2 strength and the fact that it gets a +2 from its proficiency bonus for being a CR1 quarter monster. So luckily we don't have to worry about making any kind of adjustments to our offensive CR based off of the attack bonus. There's only a +1 difference between our attack bonus and the expected attack bonus in the column. What do we do from there? Nothing. We have a CR1 monster offensively. So now we're going to take a look at combining our numbers here and getting our final CR for this Troglodyte. So we take our final DCR, which is considered a 1/8, and we add it to the offensive combat rating of 1. So our total CR for this monster is 1 1/8. If you were to turn that into a decimal, it would be 1.125. Divide that in half, and we end up with 0.5625. From here, we are supposed to do normal rounding rules, and luckily there's no question about this. Either we follow Dungeons and Dragons, always round down, or if we follow typical math rules, we're going to round down. Luckily, this rounds down right to 0.5, which is 1/2. So by looking at the Troglodyte with the rules that Dungeons & Dragons has given us in the Dungeons Master's Guide, we find that a Troglodyte with Stench, average hit points of 13, an armor class of 11, averaging to 12 damage per round, with an attack bonus of +4, our monster is actually a CR1 half. With 3 attacks per round, that's crazy. That's a huge amount of damage, especially if the poison lands and then our players are rolling at disadvantage. I don't understand what may have happened here and where the numbers got confused, but I see this happening quite often. If we were to use this Troglodyte in a game, we would actually find that our characters are not getting nearly as much XP as they're supposed to be getting from this Troglodyte. The Monsters Manual has it rated at 1/4, which is 50 experience. A CR1 half monster should be rated at 100 XP. Our players are actually only getting half of what they should be with the printed values of the Troglodyte. So let's take a look at some notes and see what might be going on here. Now, my first thought was maybe the developers forgot to add in the Stench and didn't give the Troglodyte the +1 AC it should have got for its effective armor class. If that were the case, then the DCR would actually drop down 1 because our armor class would only be an 11 versus the expected armor class of a 13, which is a difference of -2. Because we have a difference of -2, we actually drop the CR down by 1. So the DCR should have gone from 1/8 to 0 if this was the case that Stench wasn't added in. Then we would take 0 and add it to 1, giving us a 1. Divide that in half, and we have half. And that would be the CR again. Again, we would still only have a CR 1/2 Troglodyte if stench wasn't calculated into the final CR. Another thing that came to mind was that maybe somehow they added one too many attacks into multi-attack. So let's take a look at this and take one of the attacks off of the Troglodyte and see what happens to it mathematically. So instead of it being 1 bite and 2 claws, what if it was only 1 bite and 1 claw? Well, that would drop the overall damage per round from 12 to 8, which is a really huge difference, especially at lower levels. So if we look back at our chart for damage per round, we see that 12 hit points, again, is a CR1. But if we were to drop it down to 2 attacks per round, we would have 8 damage per round, and this would put us at the high end of the CR 1/2. So what does this mean? If we don't change anything with stench, and stench was actually calculated in, our DCR is 1/8, added to our new OCR of 1/2, which gives us roughly 5/8, or in decimal form, 0.625. We then average that out to 0.3125, which then rounds down to the nearest CR value of CR 1/4. Here's the printed value of our Troglodyte. We have to remove one of those 3 attacks in order for the Troglodyte to be perfectly fine as printed. That's the issue. Do we increase the challenge rating from 1/4 to 1/2? Effectively being a much stronger monster but giving more XP? Or do we slightly nerf the Troglodyte, take away one of its attacks, and then you can use the Troglodyte as printed, just with 1 less attack? So by going through the Dungeon Master's Guide for creating monsters, we've deconstructed the Troglodyte to find that as it's currently printed, it's too strong for our players, and this is why we have issues with the Hell levels. If this Troglodyte actually gets a hit in on any of our players from levels 1 to 3, there's a pretty good chance of nearly killing our players unintentionally because this Troglodyte is hitting like a CR1 monster, although it's printed to be a CR 1/4 monster. Thank you for joining me on another adventure of deconstructing the monsters from Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you've enjoyed this video, like it, subscribe, I'd appreciate anything you do for the channel. Until next time when we deconstruct another monster from D&D 5th edition, take care everyone, and I'll see you next time.